Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Naveen Agarwal. This video is a recording of an interactive Q&A session we just had very recently on the topic of risk management for medical devices. Now, risk management continues to be a challenging topic, even for those of us who have been in the industry for many years. So the intent behind these interactive Q&As is to engage in a conversation, in a dialogue. And sure enough, we had a very engaging conversation about certain topics related to risk management. And this is not going to be the only Q&A session. We will have more in the future. So you can watch the entire video at leisure. It's about an hour long. Or you can follow the time-stamped links as part of this video to scroll forward to a question of interest. So I want to invite you to take a look at it. And I hope you will enjoy and learn something new. If there are more questions, please let me know. And I look forward to meeting you again on our future interactive Q&As. Okay, great. So what are some of the ways to do an overall residual risk? I think this was an important question because it goes to the heart of the matter here. And I believe, Saurabh, you asked that question. So I'll pose the question and give you a chance to add to it or anything that you specifically want to learn. So what are some of the ways to do an overall residual risk evaluation? The assumption is that overall benefit risk analysis should include both an individual residual risk and an overall residual risk. Did I capture your question correctly, Saurabh?
Yes. And, I think a misconception for many people in the past was that anything that falls into the so-called unacceptable or benefit risk region was all you had to cover in your BRA type of assessment. And I think within the individuals, a lot of people don't tend to cover items that are in the green. And also, like, not a full understanding of how to do an overall residual risk evaluation. Like, what is the best method, the format? Is it one conclusive statement? Who does it? So there's a lot of questions there. I think that would be good to discuss.
Okay, perfect. So, guys, the good news here is that we have Ed Bills on our interactive Q&As. Ed has been very kind to join us. He has deep knowledge as well. So he always provides good perspective from the standard point of view. And then, so let me just share with you, just set this up a little bit. You guys might be familiar with this, we do severity probability type of a grid, right? This is just an example. Let's talk about what we are talking about, individual risks and overall. So you might have a severity scale, you might have a probability scale, and you might decide, my zone of acceptability or non-acceptability by this red or green. This is very simplified illustration. Doesn't mean exactly this is how you might be doing it, but it is one way. So let's talk about some of the individual risks, right? You have risk item 1, 2, and 3. Based on your criteria, they fall in the green zone. So you say, fine, my residual risk is acceptable. But 4 falls in the red zone. And you say, based on my criteria, I'm assessing this risk to be not acceptable at this time. So what the standard asks you to do is to evaluate this in the context of benefit, this specific risk, not everything else, this specific risk in the context of benefit risk to make a decision. Doesn't mean that you are stuck or you cannot move forward. So that's as far as the individual residual risk analysis is concerned. You will do that for everything. And one best practice I can share with you is to map it out like this. You are supposed to do severity and probability assignment for each individual risk. You could map it out in a simple illustration to show where everything is, right? So that's individual. And of course, you also have to do overall residual risk. And we'll talk a lot more about that in our conversation, how to do that. There's no prescription or no specified way to go about doing overall. But for individual risks, it's pretty straightforward. You have to do each one of them. Evaluate whether they are acceptable or not. And if they are not, you must do benefit risk. So what Saurabh you are asking is, if it's in green, should I still do benefit risk, right? That's one of the questions you are asking, that people may think you may not need to do it.
That's part of the question, yeah.
Right, that's what I heard you say. So If you are in the red based on your criteria, not anybody else's criteria, if you're in the red for individual risk, you must do benefit risk to see whether the risk can be accepted or not, right? You may have to take some actions, but overall risks should be always evaluated in the context of the benefit. So Ed, go ahead if you want to jump in and share some of the thoughts on that.
Yeah. First of all, there's two things that we're discussing here, I think. One is what's required in the standard, and the second thing is what's required in regulations. There is a difference. And in Europe, the regulations are much more prescriptive. And for those that are dealing with the European market, you're going to be doing individual benefit risk and overall benefit risk for everything. So that is just Europe. Nobody else requires that you do individual benefit risk for everything. And part of the requirements in the standard are that you do individual benefit risk only for those things that are not acceptable. And then you would use that to determine how much risk control you need to add to reduce that risk down to an acceptable level, or decide if it's good enough. And I always use an example of the first artificial heart was released in the U.S. into the market by the FDA when only 40% of the people that were going to use it were going to die. So it was released into the market, and the decision was made because without it, 70% were going to die. So there was a market benefit for the use of that product. And even though the risk would have been unacceptable, the benefit outweighed the risk and allowed the product to be placed on the market. Mm-hmm. However, and this is the thing that the standard now emphasizes in the post-market end, within 6 months, there was a competing product that was released that had a 30% mortality rate associated with it. And so the first one was no longer acceptable and had to be pulled off the market until they could make changes to it to reduce the mortality rate down to equivalent to or less than that new product that came on the market. So you're responsible not just during the design development phase, but throughout the entire life cycle of the product to monitor and assure that the overall residual risk and the benefit risk continues to be acceptable throughout the life cycle of the product. So it gets to be a bigger problem than we're talking about here.
Very important point. So I think to clarify what Ed, I heard from you is standard has some requirements that we should be clear about, but individual regulatory requirements may mandate more than what the standard is going to ask you. Now, the question to ask is, how do I do a specific residual risk evaluation or assessment against the benefit? Specific. So one example that comes to my mind, let's say you have a closed loop diabetes management system. You have a sensor, you have a device that gathers the data, feeds it to a controller. That controller controls the delivery of insulin. And let's say it is operating through wireless or Bluetooth functionality. A specific individual risk example would be that maybe you need to worry about cybersecurity vulnerabilities or data security, right? And despite the best controls you have implemented, if internally you assess that this is in red, that's the number 4 I showed you on my slide, what do I do? Like the standard would have you evaluate your intended use, the benefit of that intended use, and whether you can continue to move forward. Maybe you need to wait for the next generation of product to come out when when that specific risk would be below your threshold. So I think in the context of a specific item, what it does and how it links to the benefit is the individual residual risk benefit analysis. Okay. The overall will be the overall benefit of this closed loop diabetes monitoring system or management system, and overall risk. So the hard example that you gave, Ed, I would say that is an overall benefit risk.
Yes.
Overall, but that device itself will have hundreds of individual residual risks, and not all of them will be in green. So you have to decide things like, if the mechanism of action is electromechanical, how much voltage do you generate? How much mechanical force do you generate? And if you are above a certain threshold, ask the question, is it needed? Can I do with less? That will bring my residual. So you may have to have those discussions with the individual residual risk. Saurabh, any further thoughts on that? Does it answer your specific question about individual residual risk?
So when you're doing individual residual risk, right? So are there factors that we consider in determining if the benefits outweigh the risk? So like, how do you position that?
So I do have a slide on factors.
Okay.
We will talk about that. But at this point of time, you have to have a good understanding of that individual risk item, associated hazards, and what specific benefit you achieve by having that feature in your medical device.
At an individual level.
At an individual level, can you live without it? If you cut it out, remember, the best control is by design, right? Eliminate the hazard. If you eliminate the hazard, can you live with it? Or will you sacrifice something in your intended use? You have to ask that question. So it's not appropriate to sit in a room and say, this individual risk is red, but the product still has a lot of benefits, so we must continue moving forward with it. No, that won't fly. The question would be asked is, this residual risk is red. What are the hazards associated with it? And if you continue to take the risk of exposing the patient to those hazards, what unique benefit are you delivering that is essential or that is critical? Then you can say, yes, that benefit risk of the individual residual risk is appropriate. Ed, does it make sense to you?
It does. But the other thing that I wanted to bring up is the fact that, okay, my product does this, but there's another product on the market that is similar, and I have to compare my product to that other product to see if I'm at least equivalent to the other product or better than. Mm-hmm. Then I can put the product on the market. So mm-hmm. if my benefit risk is less than the other product, then I've got some work to do. And the other product could be a medical device, a drug, or a biologic.
Yes.
It's not limited to just device. So if there's an alternative treatment that provides a better benefit risk than your product, then you've got some work to do to equivalent to or exceed to use a term that I've seen here, to exceed the level of that competing product.
Yeah. So I would say that in that context, you bring a good point at it. In that context, ask the question. So there is another product in the market which is serving a similar intended use, but it's doing it differently than what I want to do. But since I'm doing it differently, I'm introducing some unique individual risks. So the question to ask is, by introducing this individual residual risks, am I going to deliver a much better benefit at a lower overall risk that allows me to continue moving ahead with this individual residual risk or not? That's one way of looking at it. Maybe they deliver the benefit by a certain mechanism of action, and that mechanism of action has certain hazards associated with that. You do it differently, and that will have different hazards associated with your method. Then you need to figure out if your individual residual risks for one or more of those mechanisms of actions are justifiable in the context of the overall benefit you are delivering, or can you live without them? Especially if you are delivering pretty much the same benefit and not much incremental improvement, then the question to ask would be, why are you introducing this incremental risk? And you should ask that question. So we will talk more, but I want to show you the next point of discussion here is, how do we go from individual residual risk to overall? So this is in the context of the second question that was posted. How to measure benefit, how to effectively compare measurable risk and benefit. Now we're going to talk about overall. It's a balancing act. So I'm going to introduce to you a few concepts which are really coming from FDA guidances. So you may consider different factors for eval, and they're also mentioned in the ISO TR 24971 to a large extent. So what are the type and magnitude of the benefits? You have to characterize those. Who benefits and how many? Who benefits meaning what's your target population? How many can you reach out of them? How long does the beneficial effect last? Is it temporary or is it long term? And how likely patients will experience one or more benefits. These factors you will consider in overall benefit risk evaluation. Factors for evaluating risks: type and number of harmful events, severity and probability of harmful events. So if you have a grid like what I showed in the last slide, you could easily map all your severity and probability of individual items. You have talked about duration of harmful events. Is it temporary, short term, or there is some kind of a permanent impairment? Those considerations will have to be made. Other considerations are also important. What's the uncertainty? If you have a brand new product that you are trying to solve a very difficult problem with, you'll have a little bit more uncertainty than other products out there. What's a patient perspective? We always think about like in aggregate, but for an individual patient, they may be willing to take a little bit higher risk with your device, especially if they have no other alternatives at an individual level. So alternate treatments. Ed made a point about what else is out, and not just devices. There could be another way of providing that benefit for the medical condition you are trying to solve. How novel is the technology? What's the risk mitigation post-market data telling you? And this is where I think pre-market, post-market comes into play, is what's the right balance for you given the benefit risk you're going. Maybe in the beginning, you tolerate a higher benefit risk, but over time, you have to demonstrate improvement in that area. So I just want to stop here briefly to see if this makes sense to you guys, and if anybody else has anything else to share. So you will do all these analysis using these factors, and you have to figure out your own way of assigning some level of a scale to it, whether it's a numerical scale or a qualitative scale. But just having low, high, medium may not depends upon how specific you want to be, right? So I'll pause here. Does it make sense? Does anybody have anything else to add to this?
Yeah, Naveen, I want to go back. You talked about uncertainty. One of the things you need to consider is if you're trying to use quantitative data, is the uncertainty of that data. In other words, what's the confidence level that you have in the data you're using? If the confidence level is low, you need to be doing qualitative estimates and not quantitative, because the reliability of that data is not sufficient to use a numerical value, because as soon as we see a number there, we say, oh, that's it. That's exactly what it has to be. That's not the case. Okay. So uncertainty is a important factor here. And there's a good question out there in the chat, Naveen.
Okay.
About benefit to risk is a term used in the MDR and 14970. What's the interpretation of this? The interesting thing is it's not defined anywhere.
Yeah.
There's no definition that you can find of the term benefit risk.
And ratio, I think we get confused with that because we are thinking a numerator and a denominator. And we are thinking more than one is better.
Yeah, and it's not possible in many cases to come up with a ratio or a numerical value. And you saw that list that you had up there, Naveen, of all the different elements of benefit, and we've boiled down the risk side to probability and severity. Okay, that's still, we're not going to have a numerical value that says risk in this one is 99.9 or whatever. It's still a number for probability, but usually in severity, it's a qualitative value like death, serious injury requiring medical intervention, injury not requiring medical, those kinds of terms, which are qualitative. So the benefit side had a larger list, if you want to put that back up there,
Yeah.
and show us, because there's a whole bunch of elements there.
Right. So again, I think the intent here is if you have good data, like Ed mentioned, and you can do sophisticated statistical analysis and you can come up with quantitative measures, great. If not, I mean, I'm sure there are very smart people in the world who can build a model to have all these factors and come up with a numerical number. I'm sure of that. Whatever number you come up with, then also ask the question, what is my sphere of uncertainty around that? Right?
Yes.
So we get, Ed, you made a very good point. We get so attracted to numbers and we get hung up on them sometimes. And sometimes the debate is between, is it a 2 or a 3? Or, hey, 1.1 is better than 0.98 or whatever. So it's a precision. We get, or that precision can be justified or not. So we'll talk more again about data integrity. I did like 2 years of a job just worrying about data integrity. But here's the list of factors again, just to go over type and magnitude of the benefits. And some of the benefits can be quantified. And there is actually a very nice case study that I will share with you later on. So they can be quantified. It's not like they can't be. You may have to have a balancing act. Some of it is quantifiable, some of it is not. And then how do you decide in aggregate? So just to give you a list again, who benefits, how many, how long does the beneficial effect last, and how likely patients will experience one or more benefits. This is coming straight from some of the FDA guidances. So I'm going to open the floor to other people in case you guys have other thoughts or comments to share. Any questions about this?
Hey, Naveen, this is Ronak here.
Yes, Ronak.
Quick question on the benefits. What are your thoughts on, or from personal opinion or from experiences, on recording benefit data for some of the accessory type medical devices? So, for example, wire guides, single-use disposable in nature. It's a means to an end in the form that it's an accessory in the bigger picture of the clinical treatment being provided to the patient.
Mm-hmm.
So the intended use does not have a direct benefit that's tangible, recordable to the patient, other than to allow the procedure to get from, in simpler terms, outside to the inside of the patient's anatomy.
Mm-hmm.
How do those factors that you showed from the FDA guidance document, I'm familiar with that, impact our way of recording benefit for such devices?
I mean, it has a purpose, right? That's why the product is in the market. It serves a purpose. So all those factors that are listed on that list can be assessed for any part of the entire process that concerns you. So if the guide wire concerns you, you need to evaluate ask the question, what would happen if we didn't have this guide wire? If there was another way of doing it? Would I still have the benefit of delivering the final intended purpose to the patient? How much of that final benefit to the patient is driven by this device or this component or this accessory? I think you can translate those factors to any level you want, any level. It depends upon how now you'll have to do a lot of thinking about linkages. It is not an isolated component in the entire value chain, start to finish. And accordingly, you will have to identify what hazards might be associated with the use of that specific accessory. I think you can drill down the benefit risk framework in those factors to any level you want. And the more you do it with better clarity, I think the better will be your overall analysis, if that helps you understand that. Anything more, guys? What do you guys think? Does this framework make sense to you?
I want to bring up one item there.
Go ahead.
Just last December of 2020, the clinical trials standard 14155 was revised and released. And there's where your clinical benefits start to come together, is in the clinical trials process. And they do a nice job of linking 14971 and 14155 together in that standard and showing that risk management and clinical trials have to work together. In fact, it requires you to do risk analysis before the clinical trials to identify hazards that the patient, in this case, might be exposed to during the clinical trial. And you have to inform them of the risks that are associated with it. So your benefit side a lot of times comes from that clinical trial activity.
Yes.
So there's where some of your data is going to come from to conduct this benefit risk.
Actually, that's a very good point, Ed. This benefit risk in the eyes of the FDA is all driven by clinical information or clinical data. You can't just provide a hypothetical or a speculative analysis with purely subject matter expertise. You have to provide what did you observe clinically, because the terminology they use is probable benefits and probable risks. They want to have a good understanding of what will happen in real world use. So they are going to rely on clinical information. So that's a very good point. Thank you, Ed, for bringing that up. Okay. Any other point on this? Any other topics of discussion?
If I may.
Sorry. I was just going to add to what Ronak said. I think that's a great question that you asked. From my experience, I've worked in orthopedic spinal systems and instruments, implants. Like you said, it's a means to an end, and the final product is the implant that gets delivered. But every component along the way has a critical role in delivering that device to the patient. And so if you have a misstep along the way, that compounded effect along the way is something that, is very critical. And, I think that plays a role into the overall residual risk as well when you're evaluating all the elements of a system.
Great point, Saurabh. I noticed you did a pretty good thing by using this raise your hand icon. So I want to let everybody know I'm not a very technical person when it comes to these Zoom.
Oh, yeah.
So if you guys are good at it, make sure you raise your hand and I will notice and I'll definitely call on you. Guys, the purpose of these meetings is not to dump a lot of information on you. The purpose is to have a conversation. Okay, that's why the interactive part to me is most important. We can have more dialogue, right? So don't be hesitant to raise anything. You raise your hand or bring up a point. So I'll pause again. Anybody else has any questions, comments?
I have a question. Sorry, I didn't figure out where to raise my hand. So for reprocessors that do not actually change the design of the device, I guess in those terms, the new risk that would be introduced would be in regards to the cleaning process, perhaps, and the sterilization process. So would it be fair to say that the FDA then or regulatory bodies don't really scrutinize as much the risk-benefit analysis for reprocessed devices?
I would say, Sandra, I think FDA does have expectations and requirements for reprocessors. There are many guidances out there, right? You play an important role in the entire life cycle. So I think you need to understand your role in the life cycle of the medical device. That's how I would answer that question. So whatever applies to you from ISO 14971 point of view applies in the context of your role. And you need to understand very clearly, how does your role affect the overall performance from a risk point of view of the device that you are involved in. And I do believe FDA would have expectations from reprocessors. I do believe that. Ed, anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, they do have expectations, and the expectations are that you do not change the intended use of the device, and that you do return it to its operating specifications. And that's not the new device specs. but and there's not a lot of discussion about this, but they expect you to bring it up to the level of performance that it should operate at through its life. And the point that you brought up about sterilization and that sort of thing is an important part of it, because you have to return it to the same state that it was when it was released, at least as far as not sterility as new, but sterility as normal use of that device. So it gets kind of a funny line to walk there, but the FDA's concern more is with the people that actually change the device. So if you replace a component in a reprocessed device with a different component than the original device, then that is changing the device. And that's where you cross the line from refurbishing to actually becoming a medical device manufacturer and creating a new device. So you got to be careful there.
Yeah, but what I would say is that even if you're not changing it, right? Let's talk some tactical stuff here. You would have a specification to deliver to your clients, right? In your risk assessment process or risk management process, you need to find out all the potential failure modes that will relate to your ability to deliver that final specification. You have to understand the impact of that spec on in terms of risk of harm. You have to understand that and be able to link the hazards in your risk analysis. The better job you can do with that, the more aware you would be of the kind of controls you need to implement and the level of validation you need to perform. And you will have a good, say, documentation to show, hey, we have done our due diligence, linking our activities in the life cycle of the product to the final patient out. And in many cases, you may not have all the data because the end user data is not coming to you. So whatever data you can get in that context and whatever understanding and expertise you have in that context, you should still do the risk analysis in the context of 14971.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I misspoke. My question was more not so much whether there is, whether there are no expectations, but more so when comparing the reprocessed device to that of the original manufacturer, assuming that the performance is equivalent, is there an assumption then that the benefit, the risk benefit analysis is acceptable, since it is a device that is out in the market and it was deemed acceptable by the original manufacturer?
I see. So you do have to maybe take another look at the benefit risk, right? So if you're reprocessing and you are losing some performance, if you're not losing any performance and you can show that, probably benefit risk still remains the same. But if you're losing some performance, you should look at, how much is the loss? And with what you're doing, is the benefit risk still favorable? I think it would be appropriate to do that. And let's say you reprocess 10 times. Does the performance deteriorate continuously, or does it reach a certain level after 4 or 5 cycles of reprocessing and remains constant after that? So you could look at the deterioration in performance, the level of benefits, maybe they have gone down, if that's the case, and how stable that is. So you may have to monitor benefit risk over time as well, to Ed's point, through post-market data. It could be challenging and tricky. So Sandra, does that provide you some more insight as to what you were thinking about?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Anybody else? Any other thoughts and comments? Otherwise, I have one more submitted question. We can go to that. Or anybody on the on this webinar today?
Yeah, I was just going to agree. Sorry.
Sorry, Naveen, I do have a question for you. I'm not sure if this is your additional slide, but if we go through and look at your list of potential benefits and do extensive research and list all of those and also, use our risk analysis in addition to the other considerations, it still feels a little bit at the end of it that it's really just a gut check. You're looking at, your benefits and looking at your risks and trying to make a determination. This is something that happens in medicine all the time, right? If you have a surgical procedure, for example, the physician is obtaining a informed consent and, they're listing out the risks to the patient. And I think it's all about a gut check in that moment of, are these risks acceptable, in consideration of the benefits. So I don't know. It almost, I'm just trying to understand, is there a way to quantify? I know we talked about that ratio, but.
So I'm going to give you guys a spoiler alert. So I actually, in preparation for when I realized that we will do benefit risk as a theme, I did a little bit more reading on this and understanding on this, and just got done with another video that will come out this week. I found a discussion paper from the FDA from 2 years ago, and they proposed a method of benefit risk evaluation of some weight loss devices. I think they did a pretty good job because they have articulated in very quantitative terms the different levels of benefits, and they have articulated the risks around that, and they developed a classification system of those risks. And they are proposing what they call different types of evaluation matrices for each benefit level. So keep an eye on that. It'll come out this week. There are ways to do it. It's a model. It's just a method, a model, a proposal that you can take a look at it. Erin, as you know, as a practitioner, and everybody knows that we are making judgment calls all the time in our industry. And it's not uncommon because we have so many factors, so many variables. What I say to that is always continue to improve your process, your thinking, as much quantitative information as you can bring in. And wherever you have these gut checks, happens all the time, make sure you have a plan in place. I hope the gut check is happening early on in development. That's why I do hazard analysis. I teach people hazard analysis, how to set it up. If that gut check is happening early in the process, you can have a plan to test them out along the development cycle. I hope you're not doing, you're not going just by your gut check at launch, because then it's like no different than flipping a coin, which is not good. So I hope you're doing it early. But even if you're going with some gut check at launch, have a plan in place. Like, what am I going to do 6 months from now? Can I collect more information from the market that will help me resolve some of these uncertainties in my analysis? That's the expectation, right? That's the way to do it. So no clear answer. I hope the video that will come out this week you will watch, and would love to hear your comments on that. I found that very fascinating. I thought it was a very good proposal that they came out with. And I went to the regulations.gov site where they opened the docket for comments. 0 comments. So either it doesn't matter to people, or it's so good that they didn't have any, which is unlikely. I think people always give comments. So weight loss devices in the context of weight loss, maybe you can adapt it to your devices as well. Good question, Erin. Thank you.
And I will point out that the word judgment is liberally sprinkled through 14.971 and 24.971. A lot of risk management is judgment. One of the most successful ways I've seen of doing overall residual risk evaluation was the use of a panel that reviewed all of the risk documentation in the file, and then performed a review activity and issued a judgment on whether the overall residual risk was acceptable or not. Many of the things that Naveen is talking about here are nothing more than rankings. They're not actually quantifiable measurements that can be repeatable in a scientific experiment. So in a lot of cases, and Erin, I'm sure you're aware of this in some of the clinical activities, that what you do is produce a survey, and then you rank the answers and then compile that all together, and it ends up with okay, this is better than that, and that kind of a relationship. But you don't have any, this is 9.2.6, anything like that in the final result. So judgment is a huge part of the risk management activities that we have in 14971. I think if I remember correctly, it talks about that either up in the introduction or the scope. The fact that it is a judgment activity.
What I would add to that, though, Ed, is that yes, judgment is expected, but there has to be a process of arriving at that. It cannot be random. It cannot be arbitrary.
Right.
And more thinking you do in terms of how we will make that judgment, right? Who will make that judgment, and who will challenge that judgment?
Yep. And it can't all be engineers. You have to have some clinical people in there. The panel I'm referring to had an engineering expert, an MD, and here's what comes up unique. The insurance carrier that provided the product liability insurance, they have a great deal of expertise in product risk. And then some of the internal attorneys that got in some of the product liability cases. And then the risk manager at that time was me. And that was a rather wide set of experiences that contributed to that judgment and brought into focus. And that's what the FDA is trying to do by putting all these thoughts together about what needs to be evaluated. And we did that by the use of the experts that we put into this situation of reviewing the risk management file and determining if it was adequate or not. And there was another thing I might mention. I don't know if this is the right place to be, but talk about the use of standards. You want to go off on that tangent?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. If this is free flow of information, if it's relevant, please bring it up.
Sure. One of the things it talks about in 24971 is the use of standards in risk management activities. And one of the things people overlook is the fact that a lot of the standards, especially those that are considered state of the art, have already identified a lot of hazards and have proposed risk controls for those hazards and have proposed testing that you can perform to show that you have addressed that properly. So the standard says, if the 14971 says, if you follow that product safety standard or that process safety standard exactly as written, then the first thing you encounter, if that hazard is in the standard, it's already unacceptable risk. You don't have to argue with anybody about it. It's unacceptable. And then if there's a risk control identified and you use that particular risk control that's identified in the standard, you don't have to do the evaluation you have to put that in as a safety requirement in the design input phase. And then if you use the verification testing that's identified in the standard and you use that and get the results that are prescribed in the standard, then you're done. The risk now is acceptable. Okay, so that saves a lot of effort and a lot of arguments and meetings that I've been in over what do we need to do about this. So if you follow the standards, you don't have to do much else. You just have to make sure you do follow them exactly as written.
Yep.
And then you'll end up with that particular problem being solved.
Good deal. Thank you, Ed. So Aaron, does that, I know we talk a lot, so I want to make sure I pause and give
Yes.
you a chance to share your thoughts and comments.
No, I appreciate hearing that to some extent it is going to be a judgment call. It is going to be a gut check. And it makes me feel better to know there's not some, easy way to quantify it, weighing the risks versus the benefits. So it sounds like it's a universal issue and it is a judgment call, and you need to make sure you have the right process in place to get the appropriate judgment, right? So it's not just kind of one person making the judgment call by themselves, but maybe incorporating other experts and having that plan clearly laid out and then sticking to it is probably the best way to go.
Yep. And then that hope is that you'll get better over time.
Right.
And then you need to confirm it in the post-production phase.
Right.
So as you get information, and we haven't talked about that, but now the standard says you need to have an active process of gaining post-production information. So you need to be going out there and looking to see how your device is used, and if it's used according to what you thought it should be, and what are the benefits being confirmed, and those sorts of things. So you're not done at the end of design development when you throw it over to manufacturing. You have to continue monitoring throughout the life of the product.
Mm-hmm. All right, guys, we have 5 minutes left. So anybody else, any questions, comments, thoughts?
I did want to point out, Naveen, we've got a couple of combination products people in here. In the US, there is a technical report, an AMI technical report, TIR 105, which address risk management for combination products. And I realize that some of you were European, but it's still a nice reference, even though you've got a different way to go in Europe than we do in the US.
Thank you for bringing that up, Ed. Niamh, I saw you were trying to say something, so I'm going to give you a chance if you still have a question or comment.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add, I think the discussion on standards to Edwin's point is really, really, a lot of people miss that. For
Yes.
sure, they don't understand that you can use standards. And I totally agree. There is the updated technical report for ISO 14971 does a really good job in explaining that. If people would only read it, I would highly recommend it. And the other part to kind of add and maybe to share, I know in the risk management plans that, I've been, involved in, we, as part of the acceptance criteria, the risk acceptability criteria, I do build in, use of product safety standards. And they are used and applied, in the way that Edwin has just described. By default, then you're done. You have demonstrated that you have reduced your risk and as far as possible. So, it's a nice done deal. And then you have traceability to those product standards in the context of your risk management file and things like that. So it's a nice win, I suppose.
Yes.
So that's good learning. And that took me a while to learn, to be honest.
Thank you. Well, it's good to share that. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. I suppose the other problem as well, I know we've kind of touched on it here. And to be honest, we could spend hours. I think it would be a fantastic topic for maybe to consider as part of another forum meeting, but it's the whole area of feeding back the information and keeping risk management current and keeping it good, right? There's been industry has had huge challenges on that in the past, and to be honest, continue to have huge challenges. We seem to have FMEAs that are sitting in risk management files that haven't been updated for years and years and years. I can share with you that during a recent review, where an FMEA that was updated in 2019, an auditor, a regulatory agency auditor kind of looked and said, 2019, and you haven't updated it since. So there is a lot of focus, and don't underestimate it. They are not only looking at dates of when these deliverables are, or they're not looking at only just at the content of the deliverables, but they're now also looking at the dates of when they were last revised. And that would, for
Trust me, we'll have a lot to talk about that. That's a very good point. Yeah. What I don't want people to think is that now you go change your procedure to put a mandatory requirement to start updating every year.
Exactly.
I want us to do that. And I will talk more about what's the best way of doing it.
Yeah, so I think that would be a good topic for further discussions. Yeah. How do you, this periodic update of your risk management file, how do we do it? How are we doing it? You know,
I'm going to give Greg a chance to talk. I know he has raised his hand and patiently listening. So please go ahead.
That's okay. Good morning. Thanks for your discussion. From your previous discussion that I looked at, I'm sorry to go back a little bit, but regarding quantification of severity, you mentioned to look to the standard of care. And I just wanted to know a little bit more about what that means, looking at standard of care, and what would I look to as a reference, capture as a reference if I wanted to support a statement about standard of care.
Yeah, so I think it was in the context of extrapolating everything to death. So the reason I mentioned standard of care was you need to understand the sequence of events that lead to hazardous situations that may result into a harm. To what extent you will do that analysis depends upon an expected standard of care in the region that you are performing, right? So you don't control the standard of care. That's part of the whole system it's a control in the whole system. You're relying on it a certain way. So the context was, do not extrapolate everything to death if it's not a clear linkage right away, because what you do then is you lose one level of severity that only be applied to death. So there is no particular reference of standard of care. It should come in your analysis that the markets you're going to sell into, what is the general standard of care, how our devices are going to be used? Where is the sequence of event stops for us and is kind of more relevant for the standard of care? Like you expect doctors to be trained to a certain level, right? You expect them to understand the instructions you provide in the IFUs, right?
Yes.
Now, that's a control, and it's informed by a certain level of expectation from the healthcare provider.
Okay.
So it was
that we do that, with that frame of reference. I wondered if it was acceptable, I mean, we haven't been challenged by it, but I was just curious.
No, so I think you need to demonstrate your understanding of the hazardous situation, how it's created in the actual use, and to what extent you're going to play a role in controlling those sequence of events. I think that analysis is done up front to be able to demonstrate that we have considered what is relevant to us. And everything outside that us could be an uncontrolled risk, but here is the expectation from a standard of care that should apply in terms of reducing that risk to an acceptable. Or that could be part of your uncertainty evaluation for benefit risk. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I think the conversation was more in terms of thinking about how to do it than to actually, create a very rigid system about it. We have run out of time. Yes. So I'm going to stop it. I just want to let you guys know that next week I'm going to be doing a hazard analysis workshop. If anybody wants to join, there is still room. And in that workshop, I basically help you learn how to do hazardous situations and harm even in the early stage, and how to use that throughout your life cycle of the product. So a lot of this conversation happens there. How do you link your hazards to harms through hazardous situations and good understanding of sequence of events? So let me know if you guys have any questions about that. There's still plenty of opportunity for you to join. So with that, any last minute burning thoughts, questions, comments from anybody? Okay, with that, I want to thank you all, by the way. 1 hour flew by, and you are right. We can talk about this topic for hours, and there will be more in future. I hope to see all of you in future again, and anything I can do in the meantime, just send me a note.